Let's take a look at two additional methods from the string class that will be helpful in Lab 12 and also Program 8, the trim method and the split method. These are very useful, and let's take a look at them. The first one we'll look at is the trim method, and the purpose of the trim method is to take a string and automatically remove any spaces that are at the beginning or the end of the string. We call leading or trailing spaces in the string. Here's a code sample. Notice code example. The string sample has a bunch of spaces at the beginning and then some spaces in between the words and then a bunch of spaces at the end. And if we would say sample.trim and store that result in another string called answer, and then print in the Java console answer surrounded by these arrows, the output would be the original contents of sample with the leading and trailing spaces removed. The spaces in between the words would still be there. It's just the spaces at the beginning of the string or the end of the string that are deleted. Okay. Now, you might say, why is that something that we would care about? And let me illustrate this with a sample program that I wrote before I started recording the video. I have a program that's going to have two text areas, an input text area at the top, an output text area at the bottom, and a process button. So the action performed for the process button, I'm retrieving the text from the input area, and then I'm going to print out the values surrounded by these arrows, and also on the next line what the length of the input would be. And then let's say that I'm going to be working with numeric information, and I want to convert the user's input into an integer. So I call integer.parseInt and store that in an integer, the num, and then I'm going to square that. So the num times the num would be the number, whatever the number was, squared. Okay, so if I run this program, bring that down here so you can see it, if I would type something like 12 as my input, okay, I can parse that into an actual integer, square it, it's 144. That works well. Well, the problem is in Java, if I would attempt, or if I would happen to have by mistake a space at the beginning of the input, okay, it's really hard to see that there's a space there. But if I hit the process button, it's going to give me a runtime error that says number format exception. In other words, it doesn't like the space at the beginning. Okay, or even if I have a space at the end here, it also doesn't like it. So the idea of having this trim method, I could, before I try to parse int on the user's input, I can trim the input and store that back in user input. So now it'll remove any leading and trailing spaces. So when I run this and I type in space 9 and even some trailing spaces, you can see that the input has a bunch of trailing and leading spaces, but it gets rid of those before it does the parseInt, and it'll process this correctly. So, I don't know, 49 squared is a big number. Okay, makes sense. 12 squared, 144, etc. Okay, so trim is very useful, especially if you are going to be taking the results of user input in a text field or a text area and trying to convert them into a numeric form to be used in calculations. Okay, so that was the example of the trim method, and now what I want to do is to talk about the other important method for our work today, which is the split method. The split method is used to take a string and break it into several pieces that are separated by a special character called the delimiter character. So when we call the name of a string .split, inside parentheses we're going to specify a character that will be used to separate the pieces of the string into discrete individual units. And the result of the split method is interesting. It's an array of strings, one string for each substring that is delimited by the character that we specify. So here's an example. Test, the string test. If I have 1 space 2 comma space 3 space 4 space 5 comma space 6, and I split on the comma, notice that there are 2 commas, so that means there are 3 strings. What's before the first comma, what's before the second comma, and what's after the second comma. Okay, And notice that the spaces would also be here. There's a space in front of the 3 and a space in front of the 6. Okay, so the delimiter character is not part of any of the strings. Those are thrown away. Well, actually, it's not thrown away. The test is not destroyed, but they're not part of any of the substrings that are stored in the array of strings that we get from the split method. Now, if I take the same string, same test string, and I split on a different delimiter, if I split on 5, well, there's only one 5 here, so there'd be 2 pieces. 1 space 2, comma, space 3, space 4, and it's space after the 4, and then comma, space 6 would be the second string, because there's only one 5 there. And if I would split on spaces, I have 5 spaces in there, so there would be 6 strings. Notice that the 2 and the 5 have the commas after them, but no spaces would be in the input there. So, I should say in the results, in the answer. So I have a demonstration here of using the split method, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to define an array of strings called line, and then I'm going to split the user's input on this character. This \n is the new line character. Okay, so that means that every line is going to be stored in a separate string in my string array, and then we can say have a loop here where k goes from 0 by 1 up to but not including the length of the line array, and I will print out the lines. Actually, this should say line here. And actually, this should say line. Okay, so if I run it, and I come in here and say, isn't this the most fun thing ever? And I click process the input. Now notice that, okay, the input starts here and has new lines in it and ends there. The length is 37 because the new line characters are counted, but I split it on the new line, and so there are 4 lines. Isn't this the most fun thing ever? Okay. Now I don't have to split on a new line. I can change the delimiter here if I wanted to split on a space. Now this is not going to be lines anymore, so this is why I had words in there. Okay, and running it. Isn't this the most fun thing ever? And I'm splitting on a space, so okay, isn't, and then there's a space, this and a new line and and then there's a space, most space and new line fun, and then there's a space, thing, new line, ever. Kind of weird. If I do something else like, this is an example of the splitting with a space. Okay. This is an example of splitting with a space. Okay. All right, so the split method, let me show you the code here. What you will do is take a string .split, and what's the result is an array which can be processed like an array. The array name .length is how many elements there are in the array, and you can use a loop to process each individual member of the array, name of the array, and the bracket with the control variable for the loop, just like we've always done with our array processing. So that's a quick introduction or demonstration of trim and split, and you'll use that in Lab 12 as well as in Program 8 for processing multi-line input in Java. Okay.